Alright students, welcome back to Medieval 1450. I hope you are all doing well. Brief reminder before we dive into this lecture, I should make sure that you all know your first essay on Hropkel Saga is due this Sunday. Remember, that is a minimum 3 pages, and remember there are specific formatting and citation requirements for that essay. Please reach out to me if you have any questions on anything like that. It is absolutely imperative that you get the essay in at some point. If you can't get it in on time, you should still be trying to get it in even with a late penalty. This is very important because, well, the essays are sort of kind of worth the largest chunks of your grade more than anything else in the class, a full 20%. So failing to turn in an essay will almost certainly cripple your grade entirely and more than likely prevent you from getting a B in this class. So please be sure you do not skip that assignment. It is absolutely imperative. Okay. So, today we will continue looking at the Crusades, but instead of looking at them from a perspective of broad events and the movements of Christian forces, we will be addressing the perspectives of the many groups and the faiths they encountered and often attack on their way. Scholarship on this topic is quite lacking, even by Muslim medieval scholars, of which there are quite a few, both English-speaking or from areas outside of the Middle East, as well as inside of the Middle East, and elsewhere for that matter. So, one major reason for this general lack of scholarship on this topic is because the Crusades, like when you hear the term Crusades, this is a Western concept. This is not a term they necessarily had in the Middle Ages, nor is it really a term that they had, or that is really heavily employed in Muslim scholarship on the topic, or at least Muslim perspective scholarship. The image of a series of discrete crusades with an ongoing movement of people to and from the established crusading states in between does not reflect the experience of most other people. Their perspective can be pieced together from references in dynastic histories and urban chronicles, but this does not equal the long tradition of creating narratives of the Crusades in the West. Of course, this is further harmed by the number of texts in Arabic that have never been translated into European languages. Many scholars do not have the Arabic skill to make use of these untranslated sources. For them, the Crusades were a series of quote-unquote wars with an enemy, the impact of which was made by the fact this was largely the same enemy launching the attacks. Remember, again, for all the rhetoric of the Crusades being to defend Christianity, Jerusalem had been in Muslim hands for 450 years by the time the First Crusade happened in 1096. No Christian was alive, or had been for centuries, who had ever ruled the land they violently took from Muslims. But let's begin by rolling the clock back to the start of the Crusades and follow their movement east. So, this period sees a massive increase in the level of violence directed towards Jewish communities, especially violence carried out against entire Jewish communities, not just part of it. Let's get a little more information about Jews, however. Jewish communities can be broadly split into 3 groups. The Ashkenazi Jews were originally German Jews who spread further into Eastern Europe. Mixing language and culture with the surrounding population, they developed the Yiddish language we know today. Sephardic Jews settled in Spain and would become influential particularly at the high point of Muslim rule in the region. They spoke Ladino, a mixture of medieval Spanish with their own language, Hebrew, and local languages of Arabic and Portuguese. Mizrahi Jews lived primarily in the Middle East, with very old communities in Babylonia, Persia, and Yemen, or modern-day Iraq, Iran, and still Yemen. Although culturally and religiously distinct from the rest of the communities, they were often highly integrated, trading practices, and even words. For instance, modern Yiddish nursery rhymes have German equivalents, even if they aren't fully mutually intelligible. Jewish populations were a minority, but were widely dispersed, particularly in urban centers, and often had connections to fellow communities across a broad region. Legal restrictions on Jewish populations in Europe meant they generally could not own land, and turned to professions that did not require land. One aspect that gave them a leg up was restrictions on usury. Usury is a concept bound up with Christian concepts of sin, particularly that of greed. While it is Or rather, while it eventually comes to mean lending for an excessive interest rate, akin to what many of us experience with student loans, for example, at this point, it is often used to mean lending for any interest. But you can't make a living lending out money responsibly if the church is breathing down your neck. Jewish populations aren't bound by these religious restrictions. They find a place often as money lenders, making a living off of this. Yet while this is a necessary service, there's always this discomfort with paying extra money back in the sense that moneylenders make money off of money instead of working. Stereotypes about Jewish communities often tie back to their international or cosmopolitan ties and their role in managing a sizable portion of Europe's money. They are, or this is, a persistent stereotype against Jews that lasts even until today. So, let's turn to their treatment during the Crusades. Remember Peter the Hermit and how he encouraged the common people to join the crusade? He is not papally sanctioned, and the Pope will eventually actively push against peasants joining up in the crusade. Traveling preachers encourage peasants to exploit Jewish populations, getting them to fund a crusade run by and for Christians. Peasants traveled down the Rhine River in 1096, destroying many Jewish communities. Jewish populations become a scapegoat. Rather than a distant enemy, they are the other, if you remember me introducing that kind of topic, living at home. Though legally protected, these often fall flat. Some nobles and bishops will protect their Jewish populations, others will try but fail as peasant threats or outright attacks force them to cave, and others sit back and watch as people they promise to protect are slaughtered, especially if they owe Jewish populations debts, which cannot be collected if they are killed or driven off. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, while preaching for the Second Crusade, spoke out strongly against anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic violence. For Jews from England to Palestine, the Crusades are just one peak in the ever-constantly evolving violence against them. Now it's time to move east. Let's take a moment to review what the region looks like politically. First, let's review the Seljuk Turks. The Turks are a people coming from the steppes around the Aral Sea. They have converted to Sunni Islam and adopted many practices of the Persian and Arab groups to the south and southwest. United by one Tugril Beg, they become called the Seljuk Turks after Seljuk Beg, Tugril's grandfather. In their rapid expansion, they conquered much of Persia, even taking the old Abbasid capital of Baghdad. In the process, they unite much of the eastern portion of the Islamic world. From there, they strike into Anatolia in 1071, they defeat the Byzantine Empire at the Battle of Manzikert. The Byzantines are all but pushed out of Anatolia. Much like the moving groups we saw earlier in the semester in Europe, if you remember when we talked about the peoples who were migrating into Europe, the Seljuk Turks bring with them Persian and Turkish culture. The Turks begin to turn towards the Fatimids in North Africa, in no small part because the Fatimids are a Shia dynasty. In 1092, the current ruler, Malik Shah, dies and the empire fractures into a series of smaller states, ruled by emirs who fight over the region. 5 years later, the First Crusade arrives at their doorstep. Since we've brought up where their neighbors stand, let's take a closer look at the Byzantine Empire as the Crusaders arrive. The Byzantine Empire by the end of the 11th century has been through some rough times. The Dukas dynasty took charge after a successful period. However, it's also just 5 years after the Great Schism. In 1054, the Pope and the Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople, the highest authorities in Latin and Eastern Christianity, respectively, excommunicated one another, formalizing the developing religious split that manifests nowadays between Catholic Christianity and Eastern Orthodox Christianity. Although perhaps necessary to recognize the growing divide, it doesn't speak well for either faith. The Dukas dynasty does not help matters either. A series of weak rulers hoarding gold to spend on internal power politics contributes to their military failures against the Turks. The 1071 Battle of Manzikert proves to be the beginning of the end, precipitating a 10-year civil war as the Turks sweep across Anatolia. Ultimately, Alexios Komnenos, a powerful general, takes control and tries to bring order to the chaos. Alexios is convinced to lead a coup, and the Empress adopts him as her son, who, interestingly enough, the Empress is only 5 years older than Alexios, so this is very clearly just a political move. He begins to stabilize the situation, and he looks for a way to gain the military support to push back against the Seljuk Turks. His request for military aid to do this is met with the First Crusade, if you remember back from the previous lecture. A large army moving through his land and causing no small amount of destruction in the process. So, let's look at the first of our two primary sources for today. The first is written by Anna Komnena. She is the daughter of Alexios the First and had a personal view of the politics at court and the Crusaders as they came through. She will continue to be involved politically for the rest of her life at the Byzantine court. She wrote the Alexiad, which includes the section describing the arrival of the Crusaders at Constantinople. As such, it is one of our best first-hand views of the Crusades. The second source tells us much the same from the Frankish perspective. So, now as the Crusaders move east, they finally reach territory ruled by Muslims. Fragmented after the death of Malik Shah, the Seljuk Turks no longer are a united people. Many rulers refuse to come to each other's aid as the Crusaders advance. Rather than facing a united front, the large crusading army pushed through different rulers' dominions, and those further along the Crusaders' path even looked upon the First Crusaders as a way to weaken their enemies. In 1098, the Fatimids recovered Jerusalem from the Seljuk Turks, even as the Crusaders advanced. They even encouraged the Crusaders, assuming they would never reach Jerusalem. However, the Fatimids were ultimately wrong. While the main target of the Crusades was the area of the Roman province of Judea, often called Israel or Palestine, broadly the whole region the Crusaders moved through, from the edge of Arabia to southeastern Anatolia, is called the Levant. Consider the population here. It consists of Muslims, yes, Sunni, Shia, and other sects of the faith, but also Jews and a large number of Christians, mostly Orthodox Christians or the smaller Armenian Church and other local variants on Christianity. Culturally, the Arabic language and culture has made many inroads, but it is mixed with local Syrians, Palestinians, Greeks, Armenians, and so on. This is the environment the Crusaders invade. Thus, it is not a cultural hegemony purely ruled by Muslims, and in fact, in many areas, Muslims were still the minority. As the Crusaders began, they returned land to the Byzantine Empire. Much of this land was what had been taken by the Seljuk Turks only decades before the Crusades. But as they reached Antioch, they were only entering land taken much earlier, but grew further from easy reach of Constantinople as well. Rulers struck out on their own, forming the states we mentioned last time, the various Crusader states in the Outremer. Often merely taking over from the prior Muslim rulers, these Crusader states, or once again the Outremer, as the Western Christian-controlled region is collectively known, do not fundamentally change this multi-faith and multi-ethnic societal base, merely adding themselves and their faith as an elite governing body into this region's already pre-existent mix. To Muslims, these Western Christians become known universally as Franks, quote-unquote, due to the high proportion of Frankish Germans and French-speaking Normans and English. However, this is not to undersell the devastating impact of their conquest, especially for urban communities. Muslim rulers, concerned about the loyalties of their Christian communities, often engaged in discriminatory practices, even excluding them from the city before crusading armies arrived. But these Christians were often just as loyal to these Muslim rulers as any others. After all, it was still their home too that was under attack, regardless of whether or not it was under attack by other Christians. They had friends of other faiths, and besides, these invading Christians are not even from the same branch as many of these Christians. It is only 40 years since the leaders of both faiths publicly said as much. Jewish and Muslim communities fight side by side in the defense of Jerusalem to protect their city. The conquest of Jerusalem comes as a shock to many. What they did upon capturing the city even more so, as despite being touted as a holy moment, the conquest itself is remarkably bloody. Most of the Muslims in the city are massacred, and the Jews are forced to surrender, and a synagogue burns down during the battle. Later Muslim sources claimed that there were people inside the synagogue, though contemporaneous Jewish sources make no mention of whether or not this is true. In the wake of the conquest, the Muslim rulers of the region had to interact with their new neighbors in some capacity. One such interaction was through Usama ibn Munkida, whose records of his experiences have survived to the present day and are in your primary sources. He is a Syrian poet, noble, knight, and politician. He traveled and developed contacts well outside of Muslim territory, including in Outremer. Now, let's take a look at what he thought of these Frankish or European crusaders. What does Usama think of them? It is clear that he doesn't really seem to think much of them, right? They seem to not measure up to equivalent nobles of the Muslim world. Perhaps we shouldn't be surprised Usama did not think highly of these foreign invaders, but he seems to have some respect for certain groups. In particular, there is a scene involving his prayer. What do some Christians allow him to do when he is praying? Well, they let him pray. This understanding of the requirements of Muslim prayer and accommodation gains some praise from Usama, and perhaps sounds much like the policy under the Pact of Omar in the Islamic world. Forms of tolerance to let fellow quote-unquote people of the book live side by side. It also suggests these Christians understand Islam enough to respect the faith. But in this instance, what goes wrong? So from the source, we see Usama is interrupted by someone new to the Outremer. Coming fresh from Europe, he's clearly far less understanding of Islam and likely driven by the narrative of Islam as the enemy that brought the Crusaders there. But perhaps Usama suggests something else. It's almost as though their time in the Holy Land and in proximity to Islam is depicted as civilizing, quote-unquote, these Franks. But in any event, it suggests that there is a possible place for them to meet, accommodate, and respect each other for those willing to listen to one another. So, let's talk about the Muslim response not to just the Crusaders, but to the Crusades and to Outremer. When the Crusaders arrived on their doorstep, the Muslims were not expecting as such. It had been centuries since Jerusalem had fallen, and there was no real reason to expect a sudden and massive response like the Crusades. Let's look here at how al-Sulami, a resident of Damascus who wrote just years after the First Crusade, described why the Crusaders succeeded. Who is at fault, and what did they do to bring about this calamity? This is also, once again, in your primary source packet in longer form. So, just as the reversals in the Crusader states were blamed on sins back home in Europe, al-Sulami puts the fault squarely on the shoulders not of Christians, but of Muslims who are not doing their duty. But he also points to a political reality as well, the disunity of Muslims. As infighting states, none was individually strong enough to resist the Crusader army with the help that did not come. Quite frankly, even after their conquest, the Crusaders aren't strong enough to hold on to what they take, as shown by the loss of the county of Edessa, but the lack of a concentrated Muslim response mean they hold Jerusalem for close to a century. So, let us fast forward to just before the Third Crusade, when this political picture starts to change dramatically. This is in no small part due to the influence of a man named Saladin, who we talked about in the previous lecture. Saladin is actually an anglicization of his full name, An-Nazir Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub. Saladin stands, much like Charlemagne does in Europe, to represent the height of what Muslim leaders can achieve, at least in the perspective of Muslims in this time period and onwards. Saladin was a Sunni Muslim of Kurdish origin. Coming from Syria initially, the modern Kurdish population is still spread across parts of Syria, Turkey, and Iraq. He traveled to Egypt as part of his service for Nur ad-Din. There, he became, at a young age, the vizier or chief advisor of Egypt. After the death of the Shia Caliph al-Adid, he abolished the caliphate and realigned Egypt with the Sunni Abbasids in Baghdad. Although they are no longer politically powerful, this sends a strong message of unifying the Muslim world. After the death of Nur ad-Din, the man he still nominally served, Saladin moved to take over rule of the regions of Syria Nur ad-Din had unified, expanding from there to steadily surround Outremer. Saladin had initially little interest in pushing against Outremer. War is costly, and he likely knew it might lead to another crusade reprisal, but some Christians threaten Muslim traders and travelers, and Saladin is forced to take action. In 1187, he begins an invasion of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Taking control of Hattin, one of the only water supplies in the area, he forced the army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem to attack him. At the Battle of Hattin, he crushes their army, with little left in his way, besieges Jerusalem. Yet, while he fought through Crusader defenses, he ultimately accepted the city's surrender. Unlike the Crusader conquest less than a century before, the conquest of the city does not end in a bloodbath. Saladin understands fully the message he is sending. This moment symbolizes that, unlike the Crusaders, the Muslims respect the sanctity of Jerusalem. It is a resounding victory of a ruler of a more united Islam than has been seen in generations. Saladin seizes Rome through the Third Crusade, the response to his conquest of Jerusalem, but dies a mere 6 years after taking Jerusalem. At the end of his life, he had little personal wealth, and most of it having been given away to his subjects. Saladin became a ruler known and respected among both Christians and Muslims. Richard the Lionheart, who became effectively the leader of the Third Crusade, called him a great prince and the greatest and most powerful leader in the Islamic world. This depiction of them fighting is entirely fictional. Although they were primarily opposing leaders, they never fought directly. They also never met in person to negotiate. Saladin insisted that they should only meet when they were at peace, although he did send his doctors to see Richard when he became sick. And if you recall back to our Islam lecture and the sophisticated medical knowledge of the Islamic world for its time, perhaps you can see why Richard would have been happy to receive them. Although Richard the Lionheart left the Holy Land after a truce was signed, they never met and only exchanged gifts. Saladin's prominence faded in the following centuries, but rose again in the 19th century. He became a figure used to express Arab nationalism and pride, and further represents an ideal as a defender of the faith who earned the respect of his enemies without sacrificing his own principles. Again, this idea of a Charlemagne of the Arab world. Being seen as gracious in victory, pious, and honorable, he is representative of what Muslim leaders can be. Here we see Saladin's citadel, a site fortified by Saladin in Cairo. It is still used. In fact, you can still go there today to see performances there, and is a symbol of a crucial moment in Egypt's conception of its own history. After all, it was from here that Saladin would have planned his campaign against the Crusader states. And here in the corner, you can see Saladin from the film Kingdom of Heaven, played by Ghassan Massoud. The depiction of his victory at Jerusalem was received positively, particularly a scene where he returns a cross on a Christian altar that had been knocked over after the surrender of the city. The Muslim test audience apparently gave it a standing ovation. But let's also not forget the long history of the other Crusades. The Fourth Crusade was a disaster, devastating the very empire whose request for help began the Crusades in the first place, and the future Crusades were unproductive. Jews were not the only groups targeted at home. Between 1209 and 1229, the Languedoc, part of southern France, is the target of what is known as the Albigensian Crusade. Though justified as an effort to eliminate the Cathars, a group of Christians branded as heretical, it also served as an opportunity for the French kings to gain greater control over the region. Papal sanction is further given to campaigns in the Baltic by Scandinavian kingdoms, and indulgences are given for wars against Muslims in Spain. In general, Christians pick up the rhetoric of the Crusades for many military causes. Such rhetoric is employed from colonization to the religious wars of the early modern period. Although violence against Jews abates to a degree after the Crusades, the Catholic Church begins to realize they will have to take a more active role in protecting Jewish communities, even if they still do not fully accept them. Many Jews still benefit financially from the Crusades, along with the urban centers of Europe, benefiting from the use of their money-lending services to fund the Crusades, as well as profiting off as increased trade network. Contact with the East increases interest in the access to trade goods they provide, and the Italian city-states increasingly compete to funnel these resources north, even after their enclaves in Outremer are long lost with the Crusader states. This contact brings with them new ideas in the Middle East, and reintroduces many texts and ideas lost from the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. Outside Western Europe, many Muslims and Eastern Orthodox Eastern and Orthodox Christians now view themselves as more allied than enemies in the wake of this aggression, as the East-West split in Christianity becomes all the more definitive. Figures such as Richard the Lionheart in the West and Saladin in the East become important symbols of national identity. Crusades remain prominent in the minds of Western Christians, and this rhetoric will continue to be used even to the present day. Consider the impact of such rhetoric, as while the Crusades in Europe and now America have been depicted as a heroic adventure, to many, especially those that lived through it, it was anything but.